I mentioned before the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. Here's a preamble which has what you might think of as, a preamble to that document, which has what you might think of as Kantian language. We read, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, whereas disregard and contempt for human rights has resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people, whereas it's essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. So the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is trying to put down international laws that will protect these things called rights that are considered to be inalienable, and the idea of inalienable rights goes hand in hand with the idea of a Kantian perspective or absolutist perspective on which these rights are absolute. They're not to be outweighed by considerations of utility. So notice then that major international political doctrines and documents and ways of trying to carry out behavior on the part of nation states have been influenced by, among others, Kantian ways of thinking. And I should also suggest that our everyday intuitive thinking about right and wrong is going to be influenced by these things as well. So if you're trained in American schools, if you were raised in many of the American school systems, whether it be private or public, you were, like myself, brought up hearing the stories of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we're told that the choice to drop these bombs was motivated on utilitarian grounds because, for example, a land invasion of the relevant islands of Japan would probably have been extremely costly to lives on both sides of the battle. But this meant deliberately sacrificing the lives of non-combatants, that is, dropping the bombs, meant deliberately sacrificing the lives of non-combatants in order to avoid a high casualty land invasion. And as a result, it's a choice that the absolutists would probably challenge. That is to say, the dropping of the atomic bombs in order to achieve the end of World War II, even if doing so produced greater overall amount of utility than a land invasion would have done, the Kantian is likely to say, even if doing so would have produced more utility, nevertheless, the dropping of the bombs would have been morally unacceptable. Here's an example of an atomic bomb going off above Nagasaki from an aerial perspective. Here's a life down on the ground kind of picture of a baby who's been affected and her mother. Probably not much chance the baby will live very long. Somebody whose skin has been affected by the blast. Lots of horrific images that are easy to find of people who are victims. And the Kantian would want to say, it's not just numbers here. We shouldn't just think about warfare in a statistician's way. We need to think about individuals, persons, lives, the sort of pain and suffering that can be caused. And furthermore, the question whether or not the individuals involved are themselves innocent, whether they intended to try to attack others, or whether they were just trying to go about their daily business. That is not to say that it's impossible when you're fighting a war from the Kantian perspective. That's not to say that it can never be acceptable to do something that might cause accidental damage to non-combatants. But it's plausible that the dropping of the bombs was something that caused damage that we knew would very likely kill and maim a great deal of non-combatants. And so that's where the ethical question is raised. So the idea that the absolutists might have challenged the choice to drop the atomic bombs on Japan is something that might come as shocking to many Americans who are sensitive to the idea of ethically acceptable warfare. But the Kantian would nevertheless want you to think twice about whether that part of our culture, so to speak, is one that we should continue to adopt or whether we should think about it in a different way. So Nagel would go on and say, just as in the case of the debaters, we can talk about the case of warfare, and distinguish between fighting clean and fighting dirty. Now, I've got a right to defend myself if attacked. That is out of self-respect. If someone is attacking me, then self-respect enjoins me to do what I can to preserve myself against this incursion. I may only, however, direct my hostility towards the nature of the attack, That is, if someone is attacking me, attacking my views, I should attack or respond to them on the nature of the content of their attack as opposed to them in an ad hominem way, like we saw in the case of the debaters. Likewise, if someone is trying to attack me in a military way, trying to kill me, then there are certain ways in which my response is appropriate, other ways in which that would be inappropriate. And I may also direct my hostility towards an appropriate kind of hostility, that is, an appropriate kind of attack. We'll come back and discuss those in just a moment. If I meet these conditions, then I'm morally entitled to attack you while still showing you respect. That is to say, I can meet these conditions on ethically acceptable combat while still treating you as another person, without having to treat you, that is, as a mere means to an end. So Nagel will suggest that, first of all, if we assume that it's persons we're attacking and perhaps also trying to kill, we need to think about the distinction between the manner of our attack, that is the way in which we're attacking them, for example, the types of weapons we use, and who may be attacked. And these cannot be overridden by considerations of utility. In the case of the manner of attack, the idea that Nagel would suggest is that if someone's trying to kill you, then it's acceptable to respond to them by sending a bomb in their direction or shooting bullets in their direction, but causing them to suffer unduly with, for example, a flamethrower or chemical weapons is something that Nagel would say is morally dubious because it causes an undue amount of suffering. So too, there are going to be limits on who may be attacked. Even if cutting off supply lines or even if attacking Red Cross workers demoralizes the enemy, that would still be morally unacceptable, Nagel would say, because he would suggest that doing so is attacking people who are not themselves trying to kill you. Rather, they're just trying to support the lives of fellow human beings. Likewise, restrictions against chemical and biological weapons are justified on these grounds because, first of all, they often kill, maim people who are innocent non-combatants, firstly, and secondly, even if they do affect other soldiers, they do so in a way that's horrifically tortuous, causes them to suffer unnecessarily in the course of trying to fight for our lives. So Nagel would say there are restrictions on who you may attack and the means by which you do so. And those come from the fact that as combatants we need to respect one another as persons, not just treat each other as objects, as means to ends. Now, recent technology has, in a way, made the possibility of carrying out warfare in a slightly more ethical way. So within the last 15 years, we've had the development of the sonic cannon, also known as a long-range acoustic device. This sends a very powerful sonic blast towards the enemy and makes it so that they cannot, without extreme discomfort to themselves, get closer to you than, say, 100 yards. This is very effective because it keeps combatants away, but it also is going to keep from killing them. It sort of immobilizes them. It's almost like a shield that they can't get through, but in the process can't do you a great deal of harm. Now, that's not going to prevent all kinds of attack. If they've got missiles and so forth, this might not solve the problem. But for those that are not that well equipped, the long-range acoustic devices can be very effective. It emits sounds, these sonic blasts that are over 150 decibels, and it does so at very long range. The descriptions that I've read suggest that the thing that you experience when you're within range of one of these things is an overwhelming desire to just get away. Drop everything and get away as fast as you can. If you stay within their close range for too long, as I understand it, your internal organs begin to rupture. It's a thing you want to get away from. But this is good because it allows us to neutralize the attacker without having to do any more damage to them than is necessary. By comparison, even bullets and bombs are fairly brutal. This allows us to neutralize an opponent without having to do any more damage than is necessary, than to just keep them from attacking anymore. About 3,000 of these acoustic devices were used over the past decade in Iraq, and nowadays, as I understand it, the New York and Boston police departments have purchased units. I'm not sure how much they've been used, but they're ready to be used in order to, for example, disperse riots. And again, these might be an ethically advantaged over firing rubber bullets or exploding bullets into crowds that are rioting, just because it saves lives while also neutralizing the threat. And I think Nagel would say, and other absolutists who discussed warfare would say, that this way of thinking about warfare puts some limits on what's morally permissible. And in the absence of such restrictions, it will always seem possible to find conditions that trump, that is, overrule treating others as persons. It's always going to be possible to find some justification for thinking that, well, at least one little bit of chemical warfare or a little bit of torture might be okay. But from the Kantian perspective, that would be a moral wrong turn. And I think many of us see that, or at least feel that, other governments, for example, or maybe even the United States government in certain cases, engage in warfare that is morally questionable. Now, is that just arbitrary or is it justified? I think the Kantian is going to want to say here, we can find justifications for our distinctions between those ways of carrying out combat that are morally acceptable and those ways that are not. And this Kantian perspective tries to give us an articulate way of explaining where we're coming from in that line of thinking.